Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in September. Now, I know this microphone is very ugly, but I think that it will work much better than my computer mic that likes to just stop working or sound weird for no real reason. My cat has eaten half of this headset, which is why I was not using it before. But, you know, we're desperate, so this is what I've got. In the month of September, I participated in a few readathons. I participated in the Monsterathon. I also did a little bit during the Yellow Book Escape, Latinxathon, and the Queer Lit Readathon's Queer Weekend. So I'm going to go in chronological order, first with the books that I finished, and then I'll talk about the books that I started or worked on a little bit. So to begin with, I reread Upright Women Wanted, which I wanted to do in August, but, you know, it waited until this month, and it was still fantastic. I actually changed my rating from a 4.5 to a 5-star, because when I initially listened to the audiobook, I think I had taken the star, down mostly because I was irritated that it wasn't longer, and that's just silly. It's a 5-star book. And this counted for the Monsterathon, for the Lair of the Babadook, which is LGBT representation, which most of the books that I read, no surprise, would have fit this prompt. And then A Moment of Peace, a comfort read, because it was a reread. I didn't really know what I wanted to read. And, you know, anti-fascist queers, that's, you know, a comfort for me. Next, I read the arc for How to Use They, Them, A Visual Guide to Non-Binary Pronouns by Stuart Getty. This book I gave a 3.75 out of 5. It was a pretty good guide. I thought that there was a lot of good information in there, a lot of good stuff going on. There were some things that I would have, emphasized a little bit more. Maybe, a little bit more on neopronouns, and really a little bit more discussion on the fact that not all non-binary people use they, them, and not all people who use they, them are necessarily non-binary. They do mention that, but it could have been talked about earlier and maybe spent a little bit more time on it. I also had a problem with the audience. It was kind of unclear. A lot of it was written for kids, I think, especially with a lot of the jokes and stuff that were put in. It seemed to be targeted kind of at a younger audience. But some of the information, especially towards the end, seemed most appropriate for adults. And there was some humor that really didn't seem right for middle grade. I would have pegged this for really kind of the slightly younger side of young adults, so maybe 13, 14, but some of the jokes were maybe at the 17 or 18, there was just one or two that were a little bit off. I thought there was important information for parents, but I thought that the writing style wasn't really conducive to parents necessarily being as engaged, so I kind of had a problem with that. That being said, I think that kind of having the mix of audience things might make it conducive to a book that a child and parent could buddy read together. So even though I kind of had a hard time with it, I do see how this kind of mix could make it a really useful tool. So overall, you know, I would recommend the book. I would recommend it to a particular type of person, I think, in a particular situation. But overall, it's good stuff. We love to see more information out there about non-binary people and language. Next, I read a book that completely fucked me up. I'm still not over it. And that is The House of Impossible Beauties. I started this last month for the Heartathon, and I finished it this month. It ended up covering the My Swamp prompt, which is a book with a nice cover. This also fit for Under the Bed, an author who is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color that you have been sleeping on. I've had this book for a while before I started to read it. It took me over a month to finish it, but holy shit. To start off with, the way that it was written, it really encompassed the time period that it was. This is a historical fiction set in the 80s. It actually focuses on some people who were actual, like, historical figures, but it's, of course, a fictionalized account of their life. And this focuses on the people who put together the House of Extravaganza, which is the first all-Latinx drag house. I think that towards the beginning of the book, there is definitely more of a balance of, like, the sad stuff with some humor or sort of sass that lightens it up some. Granted, the stuff that's going on is still pretty devastating. It's people getting, kicked out of their house, people with family members who have drug problems or commit suicide. There are definitely a lot of content warnings that are necessary for this book. Drug use, suicide, HIV, AIDS, transphobia, homophobia, death, murder, sexual assault. It definitely has a lot of really intense stuff. But like I said, towards the beginning of the book, there's at least like a little bit of balance, even though it's still really sad. But as you go through the book and as the characters who are present changes, that lightness changes. And by the end of the book, it is depressing. Like, it gave me lots of thoughts, lots of feelings. It kind of put me in a bit of a reading slump, but not like in a bad way. I think that I had just kind of overexerted myself because I read some intense things last month, and I've been focusing a lot on kind of the HIV/AIDS movement and, depressing political stuff, also current day depressing political stuff. So it made it harder to read, but it's not the book's fault, it's my emotional capacity. I would absolutely highly recommend this. This is a masterpiece. Next, I read an arc for There Are Things I Can't Tell You by Edako Mofumofu. And this one, I didn't necessarily like as much. I gave it a 2.25 out of 5. It was a manga that was a romance, high school friends to lovers. So I liked the idea of this story, but I don't think that it was played out as well as it could be, particularly since it's just one volume. I thought that this story could have been told over a much longer span of time, and it would have been much more efficient, especially since this is something that's like, you're getting flashbacks of like their childhood, and then kind of, I guess, adolescence, and then now when they're adults. I don't think that having all of that jam-packed in one volume was enough for us to really get an idea of the characters or their relationship. In particular, the character of Katsumi, I didn't think that we really got to see who he was outside of their relationship. Overall, it was just a bit awkward and rushed. I liked the idea of it, but it didn't really come out the best. After that, I read Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love in Life by Amy Gahran, which is a nonfiction book that looks at different ways that people do non-traditional relationships. This has a particular focus in non-monogamy, polyamory, but it also talks about some things that some people who are in monogamous relationships that maybe don't necessarily fit the standard do as well. This is partly a look into the study that she conducted, but part of it is also just general ways that people can do relationships differently. It kind of starts you out with the framework for what a normative relationship looks like. You're expected to have the most important relationship being monogamous, an exclusive sexual romantic partner. There's a specific way, you move in together, you get married, you have kids, etc., etc. But this breaks down different ways in which people kind of decide not to follow that and why. And it also talks a little bit about like healthy versus unhealthy ways to do that a little bit. I thought that it was really well done. I thought that it was really accessible. I loved that it included people from like all walks of life. There are people who are polyamorous in different sorts of ways. They even had some stuff from some monogamous people. There were different sorts of like queer people as well as straight people. They also talked about asexuality and aromanticism over the course of the book as well. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4.75 out of 5. And it also covered the Monsterathon prompt of Whispering Woods, a book you haven't heard about. Because, of course, I did find this book eventually when I was going through and looking for books on polyamory a while back, but it definitely wasn't mentioned or talked about the same as some of the other books like Ethical Slut or More Than Two. This is one that I kind of just happened upon, and I'm glad that I did because it was a good time and I thought that it was really useful. After that, I read Snotgirl Volume 2. I had originally picked this for the Monsterathon prompt of Secret Crypt, a Mystery. I read Volume 1 a while back, and I wasn't super impressed. I wasn't really caught up with any of the characters. Like, I didn't really get that attached to any of them. I know that the characters are, like, they're not supposed to be likable. It's part of the point. But even with a not likable character, you still have to have some sort of connection to them. Even if it's like you love to hate them or something like that. But I didn't really get it. But I did want to give this a chance. I said that I would read at least Volume 3 before making like a huge decision on whether or not to drop the book or say that I don't like it or whatever. But I did like the second volume more. I gave it somewhere between 3 and 3.5 stars. I feel like I'm getting into the flow of the story better and kind of like understanding the chaos that's happening and really getting to know the main character better. So while it wasn't my favorite thing that I've read all month, I can definitely see myself getting more into this series if it continues on this trajectory. Next, I read the group read for the Monsterathon, which was How to Recognize a Demon Has Become Your Friend by Linda Addison. For this book, each group was assigned to read one short story, but I just went ahead and read the whole thing, and it was a pretty good book of short stories. It wasn't too scary, which was nice. It had some poems between the stories, so that was neat so far as pacing goes, even though the poetry wasn't necessarily my favorite, but that's partly because if I'm reading poetry, I want it to, like, crush my heart or give me butterflies, and I don't think that spooky poetry really lends itself to that for the most part. There were some stories that I would like to see expanded into novels. There were others that I was kind of indifferent about. The one that was actually the group read for the Haunts really impressed me because there were no monsters in that one. No supernatural monsters at any rate. And it was based around basically someone who's in an abusive relationship. And that really hit. And the fact that it was, you know, in this book, they did have a lot of stories with monsters or different things like that. But this had kind of a terror that was almost elevated because it was something that was so real life. But overall, I gave the compilation 3.75 out of 5 stars. Next, I'm going to kind of lump a few different books all into one because I read volumes 7 through 9 of Saga. I started to read Saga during the reading rush. I read volume 1, and then last month I put up a Twitter poll and asked what series I should continue and sort of read all of, and that's the one that won. I read volumes 2 through 5, or 2 through 6, 2 through 5 last month, and then I read 6 through 9 this month. So I counted this for Your Friendly Neighbor's House, which is A Friend Chooses Your Read. This also went for the prompt of Area 51, which is a story about mutants or aliens, and this is definitely about aliens. This whole series was 5 out of 5. Great. I think volume 8 is the only one that I gave less than 5 stars to, and even then it was like a 4.5 because I thought that it was super slow and a little bit more heavy-handed than the rest of the series. And I am super stoked for the next one to come out, even though it's gonna come out just sometime. They're just leaving us here to float. I'm concerned. I had a lot of thoughts on the series. There is a reading vlog that is, I don't know if it's going to be up before or after this video. Whenever it is up, I'll put a card in for it, and you can see more about what I thought as I was reading Saga. Next, I read Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language by Amanda Montell. This is the book that I started for the Yellow Book Escape, although I did not finish it during that time period. It took me a long time to get through because I was having problems reading, but that's fine. This is also one that I pulled. I chose it at random as one of the ones that I was going to read off of my bookshelf, and I really, really enjoyed it. It talked a little bit about linguistic history, how there are some words that weren't gendered that are now. They maybe didn't used to be slurs, but are now, how words are being reclaimed. And it also talked about how people talk differently. So how, I know they said how women talk differently from men. I'm assuming that they were going off of, just comparing cis men and cis women. But also in how women are perceived differently, because there are some vocal things that are associated with women, for instance, using the word like a lot. But with a lot of these things that we associate with women and demonize them for using, a lot of the times men use them about the same amount, or the reasons that women use them are slightly different because of the way that they're socialized. So I thought that was really interesting. They do talk a little bit about queer language as well, and some of that was really neat. They even talked about the fact that, we have this idea of, men who sound gay, but you don't ever hear someone say, wow, she really sounds like a lesbian. And kind of why that is, which was interesting. She did mention the fact that, even though we hear more about gay lingo, and lingo that's associated with the drag scene as well, which is typically associated with gay men, although trans women are in that scene as well. And of course there are also drag kings, but when the majority of society thinks of drag, they think of drag queens, and that's kind of the lingo that people know about more. And even though that has been studied much more, that area has been studied more, that's more in the, it's pieces of that have been more subsumed into mainstream culture in different ways. But lesbian language or sapphic language, that hasn't really been looked at nearly as much, even though it definitely did exist, has existed, does exist. But the thing is, she just mentions that. She doesn't actually go into lesbian language for more than a paragraph, and I really wanted to see some more of that. She also mentions, the fact that trans people are really changing stuff up linguistically, and that was a fairly small section of the book. I would have liked to see more of that, but I do understand that that's, this book wasn't necessarily to focus on queer language, and it's already pretty hefty, so that's not something that necessarily loses at points, but it's something that I would have liked to see more. But that's also what I study, so of course I'm going to want to see more of that. Overall, I gave this a 4 out of 5. One thing that was interesting about this was also the way that it was written, because it's written in a very informal style, which at first I didn't like necessarily, but I think that part of what that can do is it can make it more accessible to people. And it also says something about the way that we think of language just by using that. So it's kind of going against this idea of prescriptivism, or there is one way that you're supposed to talk and everything else is less than. So I do really appreciate that. Those are the only books that I finished this month. I feel like I mentioned before, I don't think that I necessarily did as well this month. I was having a harder time concentrating. It was what it was. There were also a lot of books that I started or worked on over the course of the month. So first, I had Nema by Sarah Blake. I got to page 55, and this is really interesting. I definitely do want to finish this book. Like I said, was going through kind of having a hard time reading, and this book is pretty intense because Nema is basically the only person during this whole flood situation. This is a retelling of the Noah's Ark story focusing on Noah's wife, and she's the only person that's really questioning stuff, So it's really interesting, but also really intense because there are a lot of big questions being asked. It goes back and forth between, most of it's focused on them being on the ark, but you do get flashbacks to before. It's really interesting so far, but I just didn't finish it. I also started When You Ask Me Where I'm Going, which was the other book that I pulled from my shelves. This is a poetry collection that is looking a whole lot at race and beauty standards, and I'm really liking it so far. But again, I was just having a hard time with really intense books, and this is going to have a lot of intense emotions. I don't think that it would take me that long to read since it's mostly told in verse, and it's like 246 pages. I got to page 41, so I really only have like 100 pages left. So it's one that I plan on finishing, but not one that I finished in September. I also started reading Macbeth. I read through the essays that were at the beginning of this, kind of talking about Shakespeare. I kind of skimmed the one that talked about Shakespeare's life because I've taken that course. I mostly know what it's going to say. But there was some other stuff that situated Macbeth that was interesting. And I got to part of the way through Act 1, Scene 3, so not very far. I do want to finish this. I think what I might end up doing is watching the play of Macbeth and kind of reading along with it. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So, I kind of failed at ShakeTube, but I tried. I also read a chapter of Revolution Manifesto, which is a book that I started for the Fuckathon last month, or the month before last. I don't know what time is. But I'm continuing reading that in small chunks. That's looking at Marx and Lenin, kind of giving it a little bit of context. I did want to read Lenin's piece kind of before reading this, but I changed my mind, I guess. I just kind of wanted to get through this and then go back and read some of them, especially since it's giving you a lot of context within the book. So I worked on that. Then we come to the books for the Latinxathon. And I started all 3 of the books that were on my TBR and did not finish any of them because I've been having problems. So first I started The Grief Keeper by Alexandra Viasante. This is a reread and I was super stoked about it. But unfortunately, I was up in my feelings. The sibling dynamic, and all of the discussions of trauma and stuff like that is just not something that I can deal with right now. I did get to page 93, which really I'd started to read this a while back, so I was maybe 20 pages or so into it. But I was really upset that I couldn't get through it. I'm just not in a mental place to be able to read it, even though, it's a really good book. I read it about a year ago. So I would recommend it, but right now is just not the time I'm going to be able to reread it. Next, I started Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa. I got to chapter 2, so I got through the intro in the first chapter, and it is really interesting and really excellent, which I expected. This book is going to take me longer to get through because there are chunks that are in Spanish. It's not just where it's like 1 or 2 words or a sentence or something, but there are excerpts that are in Spanish. So in order to read this, I'm having to utilize Google Translate a lot, so it is taking more time and also more brain power to kind of reflect on the excerpt and then see how it relates to what she's saying. And I was having a lot of focus problems, so this one I think is going to be better for a slower read through. So I am going to finish this, but it's going to be one that I take my time with. Then I also started reading The Dancing Turtle, which I actually started reading during the queer weekend. I got about 20% of the way through it to chapter 7. And it's kind of hard to make a judgment at this point. It's written in a very unique way. There is a little bit of back and forth with time with some letters that happen at the beginning of some of the chapters, and I'm not 100% sure what that is yet. Like, I feel like that's something that comes into place later, and it's a little bit hard to follow, but I feel like that's a stylistic choice. So I think that I'm going to have to read the whole book before really making judgments, because I think that the writing style is just one that I'm not totally used to. But it's interesting. For Queer Lit Weekend, I also started reading Genderqueer, which is an anthology edited by a few people, including Ricky Wilchins, who is the person who popularized the term genderqueer. This is a new edition of the book that was published in the 2000s. It's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it. I got about halfway through it, a little bit over halfway through it. It talks a lot about people who are queering gender. So definitely people who identify as non-binary and trans, and even people who are maybe in like the margins of sexuality that are queering gender through that. One of the editors actually talked about being a femme lesbian and how that in itself was kind of queering gender. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on. There are some pieces that I've read and just really blew me away. Like Sylvia Rivera's piece in this is something that everyone should read. Especially, like, not, you know, I think that what it says about, like, gender is important, but also what it says about the LGBT movement. And the work that so many trans and gender non-conforming people have done. But, you know, those are still the same people who are not getting the same amount from gay liberation. It was a really touching piece. There are other pieces that focus on different parts of people's lives. There was one piece that I don't know if it was the same person in two different situations, or if it was they were telling the story from different perspectives. It's kind of hard to say. But it was looking at, like, BDSM, particularly as a trans person. So that's really interesting. Although that also, you know, there's a fair amount of content that's not safe for work. So if you're looking for something that's for a particular age range, you know, this does have some more adult content. There was one that was really intense from someone who is intersex that talks about their experiences of sexual abuse and then relationships afterwards, which it's obviously something that's very important, something that's not talked about very much, but it is a very intense piece. So I will say, if you're going into this book, you know, it's not just about people talking about gender in abstract or, like, vaguely how they feel about themselves. There's a lot of tough stuff. You know, from the Sylvia Rivera piece that I mentioned, she talked about all of the stuff that she went through, which was a lot of shit. And then all of these other people who are talking about these different parts of their lives. It's just very intense and very raw. So it's quite heavy. But so far there's a lot of important conversation that's happening. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about that I worked on some this month is The Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, which is Alison Bechdel's comics. This is something that I've been working on since towards, like, the end of last year. It's probably been like a year, because I originally did a trial of Kindle Unlimited, and this was in here. I stopped the trial of Kindle Unlimited and then got a used copy. And I am on page 185, so I'm about halfway through it. This month I probably read like 35 pages or so. I mean, it's a really neat comic series. It's interesting because these were written in the 90s. I think this starts out in... The very first comic was put out in 1987. I think the last one in this book was from 2008, and I think I'm in the 1997 is where I'm at right now. So it's very, you know, I think, like, palpably 90s. However, so many of the things that they mention are also relevant now. Like, even though there are, like, things that are, like, culturally quirky, or, like, things that they were talking about then that might be a little less not relevant, but not necessarily something that you're going to see as much now. But there are still some things that, you know, problems that they saw then that we still have now, or even, like, jokes that happened then that happen now. So, it's a really good time. This is not something that I am reading to, like, start and finish. This was released over a series of years, so I'm not going to sit and, like, read the whole thing in one sitting. It wasn't what it was made for. But it is something that I worked on during the Queerlit weekend. Since I am filming this on the 30th at 1 p.m., there is some chance that I would maybe finish one of these by the end of the day. I'm not sure how likely that is, but it could happen, and if that does, I'll just mention it during the next wrap-up. But that is what I've got, so far as I know, for the month of September. Let me know what your favorite September read was down in the comments, and thank you all so much for watching. Bye.